This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/audio.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 2 of True Crime California. Almost forgot the name of my own podcast. I almost said it was Twisted Listers. Not anymore, very sadly, but happy to be doing this. And I'm really excited for my second case. It's a really big case. I decided to take on a hell of a case, a really iconic case in California true crime history. And weirdly, it also takes place only about a year after my first case. So the murder of Dorothy Stratton. That happened in 1980, and then this case, the murders take place in 1981, and then the actual story takes place over a number of years after that, up into I believe the 2000s. New information was still coming out, things were still coming to light. But anyway, all of that is to say that it's a really interesting case. And I'm going to talk about the Wonderland murders. Now, before I do that, thanks to everybody who is tuning in. I know a lot of people are still listening on the Twisted Listers podcast. I'm not going to be posting most of my episodes there. So you're going to have to find me on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. I should be on all the major distribution podcast distributors or whatever the hell they're called. Anyway, I will post this one as well on Twisted Listers, but after that, it's all just going to be on True Crime California. I am getting downloads on that channel, so thank you everybody who's come over. I will do my best to link it in Twisted Listers, to link it on my Instagram, which is just True Crime California. But just come find me and come listen. And thanks everybody who has already listened. There's quite a few of you, and I'm super stoked, super excited for the support. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Let's get into this crazy ass fucking case. So, as I mentioned, this is the case of the Wonderland murders. There's so much to this story. I'm going to try to cover a lot and keep it interesting, but also condense it down. I read quite a few books about this, articles, had to go into the archives. It was super fun, actually, to kind of do this research. So hopefully it results in a pretty great second and possibly third episode. We'll see how long this one goes. So this is a really iconic murder. It took place in Los Angeles in 1981 in the Laurel Canyon neighborhood, which is a really cool neighborhood in Los Angeles. I actually work at a venue there. For people who don't know, I do event catering and a lot of weddings. And there's a venue there called the Houdini Estate. And now the Houdini Estate is obviously named after Harry Houdini, because for a time, I think in the 40s, something like that, I'm not a Houdini expert, I apologize. He stayed at this estate that's up on a hill in this area, and it's super, super beautiful. From there, it's just a magical area. The name of the street is actually Wonderland. That's where Wonderland Murders comes from, and it's a perfect name for this street and this neighborhood and sort of the vibe. It's definitely artists and hipsters, and at this point, it's rich people, which it kind of was back then. But in any case, it's a really magical and really interesting area and just a really iconic area. Now, this is definitely a really nice area, but considering the time that we're in, the year, we have to think about Los Angeles as a whole. And during this time, this was sort of the heyday of cocaine, sex, a very hard partying Hollywood lifestyle. So everybody was just doing blow. Everybody was high on cocaine all the time. Stars, it was everything from people in the street to the Hollywood elite. Everybody, ooh, that rhymed. Everybody was just doing this. And it's also right in the middle of a very big change regarding pornography and adult films. And the reason I'm saying that is because, as anybody who knows anything about this case knows, pornography and a particular porn star plays into this story quite a bit. So, to talk a little bit more about pornography in America, it wasn't actually until 1973 that it became legal in America, but you could, or before then, sorry, you could get up to 10 years in prison for being in, producing, or selling adult films. And in California, I think it took even a little bit longer for those restrictions to sort of be lifted. But I swear to you, like the moment there were like hundreds of films. It became a huge industry basically same day and has not slowed down to this day. And, my personal feelings aside, you know, the difference between can and should is very different. Do I believe there should be regulations against people starring in adult films? No. Do I watch them or support the industry? No. So it's, it's a complicated issue, but all of that said, 1973 was where everything sort of started to turn around. And within the next, 5, 10 years, the way people thought about nude models, pornography started to kind of change as well. The 80s were a hell of a time. That's all I'm going to say. So, all that said, let's go back in time to 1944 in Columbus, Ohio. This is when the main player in our story, John Holmes, was born. Now, John was actually fathered by a man whose last name was Estes, but as the man was out of the picture very, very early on, if he was ever in the picture at all, John's mother decided to give John the last name of her on again, off again husband, Edgar Holmes, even though he wasn't John's biological father. Now, these two had a really fucked up relationship. They'd been married 3 times between 1936 and 1947, and Edgar was 17 years Mary's senior. So the dynamic here is not great. And I think we should keep in mind this dynamic of the older man and the younger woman because it absolutely comes into play later on. Edgar was also a hardcore alcoholic, and he was abusive to the children. And in basically every retelling of John Holmes' young life, you will read or hear about this story, which is that one night Edgar came home so drunk that he vomited onto the children before passing out. So I imagine they were probably all on the couch, and he just puked on them and passed the fuck out. Now, finally, when John was 7 years old, his mother remarried another man who wasn't much better and basically just ignored the children. So, just going from bad to worse to just kind of whatever. Like, he does not have a good family life. He does not have good models for behavior. Things were just kind of bleak. He's in Ohio. It's just not great. So, from there, when John Holmes was 15, supposedly, I don't know if that is totally accurate, but apparently you could do this back then. He enlisted in the army. He got his mother's permission and he signed up. From there, he lived in Germany and he was in for about 4 years. And when he was 19, he was honorably discharged and then went to live in New York. Now, his time in New York is pretty difficult to track. He himself later wrote an autobiography, and in it, he told a lot of tales of his time in New York working as a gigolo and, talking about all this money he made. In truth, it's anybody's guess what he did for money or how he spent his time. Above all else, John Holmes is a fucking liar. And because at that time he wasn't famous at all, nobody really paid attention to him or knew what he was up to before he became the infamous Johnny Wad, which is his most famous stage name. He got it as a porn actor. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. Anyway, after a while, he moved to LA for no known reason, but likely because he ran into trouble in New York. And he worked a bunch of odd jobs, including as an ambulance driver. And this is where he met Sharon Jebanini, who was about a year older than John and worked as a nurse. The two married within 5 months of meeting when John was just 21 years old. So I guess she would have been 22. And I want to call a few things out at this point, starting with the fact that the two of them hadn't ever had sex with each other until after they were married. Now, obviously, John is talking about all these exploits. He's a gigolo in New York and blah, 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 blah. He goes on about having this like wealthy benefactor who gave him a bunch of money. So, he's not a virgin. But Sharon was. And this is really crazy for a number of reasons. I mean, I guess back then it was more common to not have sex before you're married. Now it's like a free for all the time. But the main thing about this that was so crazy to me is the reason that John Holmes ever had anybody look at him twice was because he has an absolutely massive penis. Now, there's no official measurement on record, but I mean, you can watch his movies and see for yourself. The thing is huge, and it's rumored to have been anywhere between 10 and 16 inches long. Now, he had a couple of friends who were in the industry with him who claimed that he measured it in front of them a few times, which super weird, but maybe not for, that type of lifestyle. And one of his friends said, "Oh, he measured it in front of me all the time. It was 13 and a half inches." Now, on top of the length, this thing was girthy as fuck as well. So it's just like a crazy, it's like I don't know, it's like two beer cans end to end, maybe even more. So, as a former virgin myself, I can't think about taking that on without shivers going down my spine. Like, it's fucked up. Um, in any case, so they got together. And John, I wanted to also kind of talk about John's early life. In his autobiography, he talks about losing his virginity when he's 8 years old. But in reality, it was more likely that he was sexually assaulted, I mean, basically raped by a 36-year-old neighbor woman when he was 12. Now, in his book, he's kind of playing these things up. It's like a brag for him, but I mean, that's child abuse. That's sexual abuse of a child. Like, it's fucked up. And so, a big part of me feels really bad for John the child, but John Holmes the adult is just an absolute fucking piece of shit. But it is interesting to think about all of the things that happened to him that sort of led to that, and how his giant penis was as much a curse as it was, a blessing in his eyes. So, John and Sharon are seemingly happily married. Sharon never knew about John's alleged past as a gigolo. John had a steady job. She was a nurse. He was no longer working as an ambulance driver, but he was working. Things were fine. But while some men have a taste for the finer things in life, John had a taste for the less fine things in life. He enjoyed gambling and partying, and he would go out to the casinos by himself quite often. Now, one night while he was at a casino, he had to go to the bathroom. So he went and used a urinal. And he was approached by a photographer who decided to sneak a peek over the urinal divider and look at John's junk and was like, "My friend, you have a gift." From there, John began making porno films. But remember, this is the 60s, so they were still illegal at this time. He had to work in the shadows, but was making good money, anywhere from $20 to $100 per film, and he was making hundreds in just a few years. He eventually told Sharon, and she wasn't happy, but she didn't divorce or even leave him. She just sort of started cohabitating with him. So they uncoupled sexually because she was just like, "This is not fucking cool with me." But she loved him. And she was like a very, she's a very old fashioned woman, obviously. So she never left him. In 1969, while John was doing all of these, illicit videos in the shadows and trying to not get caught, a court ruling made it legal to have pornographic movies in your own home, thereby opening up the country to such classic films as Deep Throat from 1972, and a little bit later, Debbie Does Dallas in 1978, among hundreds and hundreds of other films. So pornography still wasn't fully legal, and John ended up getting arrested for prostitution and I forget what it was, like pandering, something. But he decided to become an informant for the LAPD to avoid jail time. This was the start of a long and storied relationship between John and the LAPD, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Suffice it to say, this guy would do anything to get out of trouble, and we'll kind of see that as the story unfolds. Now, John, in his career, became the character Johnny Wad. This is starting in 1971. And it was like supposed to be kind of noir film. He was a detective trying to hunt certain things down. And of course, he just had to have sex with multiple women in order to do it. These movies were a fucking smash hit. I think there's like six of them that have to do with him. There's one just called like Johnny Wad. And from there, he just became like a fucking star. Everybody knew him. Everybody wanted to know him. He was like, despite being a pornographic, triple X star, he was known really well in the mainstream world. And as his fame grew, so did his love of partying. Now, he was making as much as $3,000 a day shooting these films. And he was, had good money for a while, but the party life will drain you pretty quick. And even though, he started to associate with people in Hollywood, a lot of those people were the wrong people. Now, like I said, we're entering into sort of the heyday of cocaine, freebasing, freebasing cocaine. It's like basically kind of like crack. I don't know. It's not crack, but basically you use baking soda and you bake the cocaine down and then you smoke it. And it's like the purest form of it, but it also takes like a ton of cocaine and reduces it down to a tiny little bit. So it's the most expensive way to do this. And in any case, Johnny Wad here got really fucking into this. He started just snorting cocaine, and before you know it, he's freebasing, which, on top of being way more expensive, is also far more addictive than just snorting cocaine. And on top of that, using this, using drugs, using cocaine, freebasing, it affected his ability to stay erect and therefore to have sex and therefore to work. So he's using the money he has to buy these drugs. He's getting addicted to these drugs and it's making it difficult for him to work, which makes it difficult for him to get money. So John starts to turn to crime. Like I said, he's meeting all the wrong people in Hollywood. He starts to meet some fences that can sell, his stolen property. A fence is like somebody who sells your stolen property. I basically kind of just said it. And he starts, you know, thieving. He starts robbing. He's just doing anything he can. He's running up Sharon's credit cards. He's stealing people's jewelry. He's just doing anything that he can to make money. And the situation is just getting, more and more dire, more and more kind of pathetic. He's running out of money, and his addiction got up to being more than he was making in a day, even at the top of his game. Before all of this went super sideways, though, I did want to go back a little bit and to say that John did have a very lucrative career, but he also worked as an apartment manager with his wife Sharon in Glendale, California. It's here in 1976 that he meets then 15-year-old Dawn Schiller. When he met Dawn, he said something about how it's too bad she was so young, but it quickly became clear that he didn't care at all about her age. Within a very short time, John was able to befriend Dawn and then seduce her. They became sexually active pretty quickly, and before long, John was controlling Dawn entirely. She never even finished the 10th grade. Now, I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about Dawn because she plays into this story, and also I think her story, which isn't exactly the Wonderland story, is still a story worth telling on its own. And in fact, she has a really great book I read called The Road Through Wonderland, Surviving John Holmes. It's a really interesting, raw kind of take on her experience, and it gives you a really in-depth, sort of detailed telling of this side of John Holmes that I think a lot of Hollywood movies and a lot of, stories don't really drive home in a way that they should. Because this guy was a fucking evil piece of shit. And even, watching the movie Wonderland, they make him sympathetic. And it's really problematic to me. So reading her book was really great for giving me a lot of perspective about this case and who he was that I think was missing in a lot of mainstream media that discussed this case. Even when they sort of went in on him, she was kind of just glossed over, and I think that's really unfortunate. Dawn Schiller was born in 1960 to an American GI father and a German immigrant mother. She had a younger sister and also a younger brother, Wayne, who was 4 years younger than she was. Her parents were happy for a time, but her father unfortunately went away to Vietnam, and when he came back, he was a completely different man. He moved the family from New Jersey to Florida and then left the family there for years while he went overseas. He convinced his grandmother to sell her home in New Jersey and move to Florida, and then basically just fucking abandoned the family. When he returned, there was a lot of abuse, and her parents divorced when she was 15 because her father brought another woman back with him from overseas. So her father then moved out to California, and she and her younger sister Terry went with him. And that's where she met John Holmes. Dawn's dad was not great. He got her into smoking weed. He was I feel for the guy. He probably had a lot of PTSD, but, he's taking it out on his kids and they're just not being set up for success. Dawn said that she would roll him joints before leaving for school in the morning. So clearly he's a very damaged man and he's damaging his children, then leaving them open to being taken, in by a disgusting creep like John Holmes. So John Holmes meets Dawn and he just love bombs her. And they end up being together for about 6 years. Now, during their time together, John became more and more addicted to freebasing. And on top of his own porn career, he would also not only get Dawn addicted to the drugs, but he would force her to sell her body for drug money. Their time together is detailed in her book in such a fucked up way. Like the things that she says that he did to her, and I obviously they're all true. He would beat her, he would rape her, he would force her to, do sex work to fund his addictions. He would leave her for days at a time, not only in cheap hotels where she was kicked out numerous times because of his drug issues and the fights they would get into, which were really just him beating her, but he also, when they finally took off out of Glendale, he took Sharon's car and he would leave Dawn in it for days at a time while he was gone running drugs for people to make money. And that is what John Holmes did eventually, is he became a drug runner so that he could keep his addiction going. And, Don would talk about if he came back and couldn't score or things didn't go well, he would take it out on her. She talks about one time he beat her so badly that he broke multiple of her ribs and almost killed her. And she said he had not treated her well in ages, and he was so scared that he had gone too far, and probably just that he would get in trouble, that he went back to like love bombing her. But he started with the love bombing. He took a 15-year-old, when he's in his fucking 30s. He's like 20 years older than her. And he love bombs her until she just gives him whatever he wants. And then he gets her under his spell. He gets her addicted to drugs and he abuses her in unimaginable fucking ways. And I'll get into more detail on that a little bit farther into the story, but I just kind of wanted to set the scene there because I think it's really important to kind of look at all of the people in the story and how this disgusting man harmed them and fucked their lives up, because this guy is just the worst. Now we sort of set the scene and introduced you to a lot of the people and really talked about John Holmes. I'm going to introduce a few more people to the story. Now, as I had mentioned, John was getting into crime to support his drug habit. He'd met a ton of really shitty people around Hollywood. Hollywood was in the throes of drug addictions and party culture. And, a lot of people knew people who were into some bad shit. And nobody was into more bad shit than the infamous Eddie Nash, a nightclub owner and cocaine dealer with his hands in many pots, who allegedly owned the police. And I think it's kind of true. Eddie owned celebrity hangout clubs like the Odyssey, the Seven Seas nightclub. He owned a bunch of strip clubs, gay clubs. He had a club for every type of person. He didn't care. He just wanted your money. And he sold drugs, a lot of them. He lived in what is still one of the nicer areas of Studio City, which is just over the hill from Hollywood in the valley. And it's weird because I swear I've driven by his house and like didn't even know it. There's the streets called like the Donas. It's Dona. I always thought it was Doña, like, Spanish, but apparently everybody just calls them the Donas. But anyway, he lived there in this really nice house because he was selling a fuck ton of drugs. He had all these nightclubs, and he had a full-time live-in bodyguard named Gregory Dials. Gregory Dials was a 300-pound karate master who carried a gun at all times and lived with Eddie, like I said, and sort of almost took care of him in like a weird way. Gregory had a crazy sort of reputation. There were stories of him chasing a man out of one of Eddie's clubs with a loaded gun and unloading it into his car across Hollywood Boulevard at 2:30 in the afternoon. So just in broad fucking daylight, this guy is shooting at a man into his vehicle. He could have hit anybody. He could have hit a bunch of cars. So the guy is pretty fucking gnarly. Let's just say that. So Eddie and John became friends. Eddie really liked John, despite the fact that most other people did not. I think he liked that he was a porn star, probably the most famous one around at the time. And Eddie was a weird fucking dude who liked to do crazy shit. Like he would have people come over and play Russian roulette in front of them just to freak them the fuck out. He would also have people come over and sit in his living room, and he would leave them there for like hours, and he would leave drugs out, and there were two-way mirrors there. And if people fucked up and used any of his drugs, he'd kick them out and they were fucking like out of the club. Like they couldn't ever deal with him again. So this guy was really weird, and he was freebasing like $8,000 a day, like ounces and ounces every single day. So he's erratic, his brain's all fucked up. He's just a weird, bad fucking man. Eddie Nash was a Palestinian immigrant. His birth name was Adel Nasrallah, who came to America when he was 22 years old with only $7 in his pocket. He built his fortune in the beginning through hard work and started small with a hot dog stand he called Chuck's Beef. He sold hot dogs in Hollywood, but also did some unknown and likely unsavory things and was able to save money until he could buy more and more clubs and build his empire. And he had like a punk rock club, and he would sell most of his drugs out of there. So he would sell Quaaludes, which don't even exist anymore, but he would do, all sorts of his illegal activities out of that club. Eddie was a ruthless businessman, and everybody who knew him was terrified of him. Everybody called him evil. Like John Holmes said he was the most evil man he'd ever met. And I'm like, I think you're the most evil man you've ever met. But regardless, Eddie was fucking crazy, super scary. John once told Don, like, there's hundreds of bodies buried in the desert and nobody will ever find them. And that's all Eddie Nash. And to be totally honest, I don't doubt that. Like, he's a scary ass fucking guy. He's also a really trippy guy in that he would always kind of be there for his friends. Like if one of his friends got in trouble, he would help them out. But then he would always kind of want something in return, which is probably not surprising. And one of these instances in particular that is outlined in Dawn's book is one time when John Holmes got arrested for drugs. Dawn anonymously called Eddie Nash and Eddie bailed him out. In return, Eddie um, basically told John, if you don't tell me who that woman was who called, I'm going to fucking cut you off from drugs and you're going to be in deep shit with me. So he introduced Dawn to Eddie as his niece Gabrielle and then forced Dawn to have sex with Eddie. Now, Eddie drugged her, likely with heroin, and basically raped her while she was unconscious. And John had no problem with this. Like, he just wanted to save his own ass. So in any case, really bad fucking people here. He was extremely rich. He sold copious amount of drugs. He had popular nightclubs, and he liked to party really hard. By the time this whole situation takes place, Eddie Nash had already had one lung removed, and one of his nasal cavities was like gone because of all the drugs he did. Like I said, upwards of $8,000 in freebase cocaine every single day. So there's a couple movies that are inspired by the John Holmes case. We're talking Boogie Nights. They also did Wonderland. And Alfred Molina plays a character inspired by Eddie Holmes in Boogie Nights. You should watch it. It's fucking crazy and it's so spot on. I've already seen the movie, but after I realized that's what it was, like who he was playing, I went back and watched the scenes with him and it's fucking crazy. So Eddie would always wear a maroon silk robe and a Speedo, and that's just like how he lived his fucking life. So now we've set the scene with Eddie. So after they become friends, John would spend hours at Eddie's house. He would also spend thousands of dollars there as well, and he would also do Eddie's drugs for free. But as many drug addicts do, he would get too deep into debt with Eddie and have to find his drugs elsewhere for a while until he could do some drug running to pay off his debt. And when this happened, he would hit up Ron Lanius and the Wonderland gang. Now, the people in this so-called gang included Ron Lanius, who was the leader of the gang. He was a drug dealer and drug user and had done murder for hire and was just a ruthless piece of shit. And on top of doing murder for hire, he just killed people. Like, he was the kind of guy that if you pissed him off, if you crossed him, he would fucking kill you dead. And he was a suspect in multiple murder cases over the years, including when this story happens. It was suspected and he was probably going to be arrested for murder. He was 37 years old at the time of this story. Ron's wife, Susan Lanius, was not super involved in like the gang, but she was kind of around. She was on again, off again with Ron. She was a drug user. She was 29. We also have Billy Deverell, who is Ron's right-hand man, sort of a co-leader of the Wonderland gang. He apparently was something of a decent person who would go into deep depressions over his actions, but ultimately he was a violent drug addict. He was 44. Then we have Joy Miller. This is Billy Deverell's girlfriend and the leaseholder for the house. She was formerly married to a Beverly Hills attorney and had two daughters, but she became a drug addict, I believe, after taking pills for pain. She'd actually had breast cancer and had sort of just gotten over it. And I believe that the use of the pain meds that she took during that time had led to her use of heroin. Now, she was 46. The next person is David Lind. He was a biker from NorCal. He was in the Aryan Brotherhood, spent most of his adult life in prison. He was 40 at the time that this goes down, and he had come to Los Angeles to hang out with Ron and get some drugs and also get out of Sacramento, where he'd run into a lot of trouble. And with him, he brought Barbara Butterfly Richardson, who was his 22-year-old girlfriend. So again, we've got a 40-year-old with a 22-year-old. These people are all trash. So they were called the Wonderland Gang because they lived in that house on Wonderland Avenue. It was 8763 Wonderland. There was and still is a very, or it was and still is a very nice area. And additionally, before the gang lived in that house, the band Paul Revere and the Raiders stayed in that exact house as well. So it was a well-known house. It was a very nice but chill area. And it was weird that they lived there and had the lifestyle they did, because they would throw wild parties and have people at the house all hours of the day and night. They would do cocaine, they drank, they had loud parties, they did heroin. Most of the Wonderland gang was like, horribly addicted to heroin. So they were addicts, criminals, and they were just a lot of trouble. And while John was a regular at their house, he was never a part of their gang, mostly because Ron Lanius fucking hated him. And in return, John Holmes feared and likely hated Ron Lanius. But because of the drugs, John always played nice. If it hasn't been well established yet, John Holmes has no morals. He has no problem using anybody and everybody to get what he wants, and he's just a scummy, wormy piece of shit. And what he wanted was copious amounts of drugs. So now we're in 1981. John has been hanging out with this group for a while. He's in them for a lot of money. And he was drug mule for them, but would smoke up the drugs and his profits and tended to end up in debt. There was also a point, the Wonderland gang never met Eddie Nash, but they did a deal with him through John where he bought some antique rifles from them. But they knew that they were worth a lot of money, like $75,000 back in 1981. Eddie knew that if he ever displayed them or if anybody ever saw them, they would immediately know they were stolen and he would get into a lot of trouble. So he ended up giving the Wonderland gang $2,000 for these rifles, saying that he would figure out a way to give them more money later, but it was kind of like his hands were tied because he couldn't really do anything with them, even though he thought they were cool. At least that's kind of my understanding of what happened with these guns. So the Wonderland gang's kind of like fuck Eddie Nash, but what it really came down to was that at the time that the story takes place, they were low on cash and desperately in need of drugs. John, seeing an opportunity, suggests to them that he has a big score in mind. And he does this, to get in their good graces, to get out of debt, and to get some money and drugs in return. He tells them, hey, that guy Eddie Nash, the one you guys don't really like that much, he has a ton of drugs and money in his house, and he has a safe under his bed in his bedroom that's full of drugs and money, and we can go get it. The safe was hidden in the floor, so very few people knew about it, but John did. He told the gang they could rob Nash and they'd never know who did it. His plan was that he would go into the house earlier in the evening and buy some drugs. He would then unlock the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Ron and his crew could then sneak in the middle of the night and hold Nash hostage, make him open up the safe, and make off with all of his money and drugs. Now, John also drew a map for them. So he was really, into this and thinking about, what's he going to get out of this. So despite both the Wonderland gang and Nash having done business and both knowing John, they had never met. Now, this was advantageous to the Wonderland crew because they could go in without masks or fear of being recognized. It was also a bit of a disadvantage because they didn't seem to know who the fuck they were dealing with. The fact that Eddie Nash had killed tons of people, had cops on his bankroll. I mean, it's fucking nuts how connected and how crazy this guy is. Beyond all of this, he's just very fucking evil. And it was dumb as fuck to think he'd never figure out who robbed him since barely anybody knew about the safe. However, drug-addled brains aren't typically the smartest brains out there, so the gang went through with the plan. It's now Sunday, June 27th, 1981, and John goes to Nash's house and buys about $400 worth of drugs. This is all the gang could come up with, but it was enough. He, of course, spent the hours after buying it there, doing all of the drugs, instead of taking them back to the Wonderland crew. But whatever. He went ahead and unlocked the door. He eventually got back to the house on Wonderland, but then got nervous that he hadn't actually unlocked the sliding door, so went back to Nash's place to check. I have read that he went back twice, and I've read that he went back 3 times. Either way, it's suspicious as fuck, but he seemed to think he was smooth and that Nash wouldn't question it. By the time Holmes got back to Wonderland, Ron, David Lind, Billy Deverell, and a friend of theirs named Tracy McCourt had taken too many drugs. Tracy's a man, by the way, including heroin, and they were nodding off and not at all ready to rob anyone or even move. So they slept until about 8 a.m. on Monday morning, which is when they all got into a car driven by Tracy, who was an idiot but not super involved, and drove the less than 2 miles to Nash's house at 3315 Dona Lola Place. The car was empty on gas, which is just another piece to let you know how fucking out of it these guys were. But somehow, they made it to Nash's home right around 8:30 a.m. on a Monday, June 28th, when everyone is on their way to work, school, whatever. I wanted to take a moment to discuss how crazy Hollywood and Los Angeles in general was at this time. Like I said, this was about a year after Dorothy Stratton was murdered, which was huge news, but it was literally like almost exactly a year later that this takes place. And the amount of murders, serial killers, drug lords, and general chaos in the area at the time was just something that I don't know that we could really imagine. The detective, one of the detectives anyway, that worked on the Wonderland case, was also involved in catching William Bonin, otherwise known as the Freeway Killer, and also worked on the Hillside Stranglers case, which back then was the Hillside Strangler because they didn't know it was two people. So shit is just nuts. And maybe an 8:30 a.m. robbery wasn't super weird back then, but I think with all the information we know, it was just because these guys were drug addicts and fuck ups in general. Anyway, when they get to the house without John Holmes, who of course, waited back at Wonderland, they get inside. So we have David Lind, Billy Deverell, and Ron Lanius. Tracy waits in the car. They break in, they pretend to be cops by flashing a badge for the San Francisco Police Department, which is actually what they'd been doing recently to rob other homes in the area. And that's the only way they were making money, is by doing like open fucking robbery of people when they were home, like robbing them, pretending to be cops. They would break in, say they were cops, tie them up, and steal all their shit. So they find Dials walking down the hallway holding a tray that possibly had Eddie Nash's breakfast on it. Eddie Nash is in his, trademark Speedo, no robe, just the Speedo, sitting on his couch. They make Gregory Dials lay on the ground. They attempt to handcuff him, but he's too big. But they finally, end up tying him up. They then pull out their guns and they begin, demanding money and drugs. Nash has said to have begged for his life, which I'm sure pissed him off maybe more than anything else in his life ever had. Because he's a tough guy and he's like wants to be the big boss. So that's a ultimate, insult to him. They begin ransacking the place, and then they move Eddie into his bedroom and they force him to open the safe nobody knows about. He at first refuses to give them the combination, but Ron Lanius or David Lind, I can't remember who, put the gun into his mouth and was like, I will fucking kill you. And he opens the safe and they steal over $1 million in drugs and cash. And that's $1 million in 1981 dollars. So way more today. At one point, David Lind accidentally discharged his gun and grazed Gregory Dials like on the either the leg or like the chest. It was more of like a powder burn than like an actual shot, which only further terrifies the captives and lets them know that these men will fucking kill them, possibly by accident. It's later found out that Ron Lanius, who was at the time, like I said, a very serious suspect in multiple, murder cases, including a murder for hire case, wanted to kill Eddie and Gregory Dials, but was talked out of it by Billy, who, like I said, was kind of like the level headed guy of the group. So eventually they make their way out of the house after cutting the phone lines. They make their way back to Wonderland and they split up the score. Now, Ron, David, and Billy get their share, which is a fuck ton of money. John Holmes and Tracy McCourt get much smaller shares. For Tracy, he was just the driver, so it's like, fuck you. For John, it's because they fucking didn't like him. And he owed them money, and just fuck him. As you can imagine, John wasn't super happy about this, but he was kind of a little bitch. So when he complained, the Wonderland gang beat him up and then sent him on his way. Like, go fuck yourself. They gave him $3,000 and a pinky ring that belonged to Eddie Nash. Now, Eddie Nash gets untied, gets his phone lines back up, definitely doesn't call the cops, but he is thinking who might have ripped him off? Who had the information? Who could have done it? Who knew about the safe? Who's going to unlock the door? Who was there? And very quickly, all signs point to one man, John Holmes. Now, I want to point out that Eddie Nash loved John Holmes. He referred to him as his brother, to the point where when John got arrested and had Dawn call anonymously, he told her, just say your brother is in jail. Don't say anything else. Don't say my name. Just say your brother is in jail. And Eddie knew exactly who he was talking about. So that's the kind of relationship that Eddie thought he had with John Holmes. So when he figures out John's the one to fucking, double cross him, he is super pissed. Now he sends Gregory Dials out to get John. Um, and when he finds him, and I read somewhere that like John decided to come over because he's just that cavalier, but that's not what happened. So Gregory Dials goes out and he finds John, and when he finds him, John is wearing Eddie Nash's fucking pinky ring because he's a fucking idiot. So he brings John into Nash's office by the scruff of his neck, and it gets crazy from there, according to John Holmes. But there is somebody to kind of back it up, which we'll talk about later. And mind you, at this time, Dawn is just living with her tiny little dog. They had a dog named Thor, and they were just living in Sharon's fucking car. Like, he gave her cans to piss in. He never let her leave. And also, he never let anybody know about her. When he drove around with her, he would make her lay in the back with a blanket over her head. Nobody knew about her. The Wonderland gang didn't know about her. Eddie Nash didn't know about her. I mean, when he raped her, he thought it was John's niece, Gabrielle, from Oregon. So, I mean, he was really, really careful, and he just basically held her captive for years. So she's sitting in a car somewhere, having no fucking clue where John is. Meanwhile, he's at Eddie Nash's house getting the shit beat out of him. Now, when this happened, there was another man at the house named Scott Thorson. Scott will play into the story more later, but just remember his name and that he was the lover and also adopted son of Liberace. And I'm just going to leave that mess right there, and we'll get into that more later. So he's asked to wait in the other room while Nash and Dials do their thing with Holmes. He said later, they beat him. And John says, according to him, they're threatening to kill his wife, his mother, his siblings, everyone in his family. He said they found his address book and they're running through the names being like, they're fucking dead. They're fucking dead. You don't tell us who you had rob us. Everybody you've ever known is fucking dead. So, I think maybe he was embellishing the story a little bit to make himself more of a victim, and you'll see why, but who knows. In the end, John tells them, this is who ripped you off. Yes, I facilitated it. They were mad about these fucking antique guns. They needed money, whatever. Eddie Nash decides that rather than kill Holmes, he will make him help Nash exact his revenge. So now it's Wednesday, July 1st, so like 2 days after the robbery, and Holmes never leaves Nash's house until we're at the part where the murders go down. So Nash tells Holmes he's going to go to the Wonderland house and let Gregory Dials and another man into the house through the locked gate. He's supposed to do this by calling up to the residents who know him and will let him in because there was like a metal security gate that was always locked. It is also said that at one point, Joy Miller, Billy Deverell's girlfriend, gave John Holmes a key, which Ron was not fucking stoked about. So maybe he used that to get in. And kind of when you read about the crime scene and where the bodies were, it almost makes sense that he let himself in, but I don't know. I've heard both ways. So anyway, they go to the house that same night, and Holmes gets in, one way or another. And what happens next is the definition of a massacre. The next day, the neighbors who were moving out because they were tired of dealing with living next to this fucking drug house said that they saw several people going in and out of the residence, which was normal. This happened between 4 a.m. and 4 p.m. that same day, so about 12 hours of people coming and going. Finally, one of the visitors to the house told one of the movers who was moving the people out, there are dead people inside that house. The mover took a look for himself and immediately called the cops as he had seen the most fucked up scene. Police and detectives arrived shortly thereafter to find 5 people inside. There was Barbara Butterfly Richardson, again 22 years old. She was found in the living room with her head caved in. There was a pillow on the couch completely soaked in blood, and she had fallen to the ground and bled out some more. You can watch a video of this on YouTube. We'll talk more about it. She was very much dead. She had been for hours. They then found in Ron and Susan's room the body of Ron Launius and the barely alive Susan Launius. She was still clinging to life after 12 hours of being, after being beaten. And that means all the people who went in and out of the house over the past 12 hours did nothing to help her, despite hearing her moaning. Neighbors also said they heard moaning, but they didn't really think anything of it because the house is fucking crazy. Susan was taken to the hospital where she wasn't expected to survive, and the police continued their search of the space. In the upstairs room, they found the bodies of Joy Miller and Billy Deverell. Joy had been killed in bed, much like Ron, but Billy had put up a fight and was found crumpled on the ground with his head against a TV stand. Now, the TV was on, but just playing like fuzz on the screen, which I don't even know if you can get a TV to do that anymore, but it's a very creepy thing to think about in a murder scene. Billy was shirtless and covered in blood and had clearly put up a fight. Joy's head had been so badly beaten in that her forehead, like above her eyebrows, was pushed all the way back against the back of her skull. So fucking crazy. The scene was brutal. There was blood all over the walls, all over the house. It's insane. So at this point, I want to just quickly introduce the two main detectives who were on this case for years, for better or worse, because officially this case is not solved, even though we all know who did it. So these detectives are Tom Lange and Robert Bob Souza. Now they arrive on the scene, and I believe it was Tom who took a 2.5 hour video of the crime scene. And that's, those of you with strong stomachs can find some of it on YouTube. You can hear him narrating while filming the victims up close, as well as the horribly, blood spattered house. The video shows the lifeless bodies of the victims, including Joy Miller, who is purple and unrecognizable while lying in bed, and that shit haunted me for days after I watched it, and I've seen some shit. So it's really disturbing. Be careful if you do choose to watch it. But also, really interestingly, it would later be the first video used as evidence in a murder trial in California. So we'll get there, but it's pretty cool to know that. Once the video is done, police begin their interviews. Now, at first, not a lot comes up, but pretty quickly they get a call from a man named Fat Howard, or Howard Cook, who said he had a witness who wanted to talk about the murders. He asks that they meet him at the Wonderland address. And when they do, he's in his car outside, and he points to the house and says there's someone inside. And that's definitely a crime scene. So it's been a couple of days, like the bodies are with the medical examiner, but still, he should not be in there. So they go inside to find David Lind, who was one of the only people not in the house when the murders took place, as he had had to go up to Sacramento for a court date. And then when he came back, he was in a motel with a male sex worker doing drugs. And he left Butterfly behind in the house in the care of his friends. Now, when they got into the house, David was ransacking the place, grabbing pills off the floor, shoving them into his mouth frantically. And when the detectives were like, "Hey, bud, what are you doing?" he asked them where Butterfly was, convinced she was the sole survivor he had heard about on the news. Now, we all know that she was not the sole survivor, but the police did not tell him that right away. Instead, they took him to the station to interview him, and once they told him Butterfly had died, he was ready to talk, as long as he was able to openly do the pocketful of drugs that he had brought with him, which they let him. He wasn't being aggressive towards them, and they felt it would help keep him cooperative. So David Lind recounted the entire burglary at Nash's, which gave them their first solid lead as well as a motive. It also brought John Holmes into the fold, as his name hadn't yet been mentioned. Granted, this was in the first week of the murders, but still, it took a few days to figure out who was involved. Anyway, Lynn tells them about the score, how it was split, just kind of lays it all out for them. But obviously, he wasn't at the house the night of the murders, so he's not really able to place anyone at the scene or give them anything super concrete. He could just sort of suggest who might have done this and why. So from there, police interview a ton of other people about the murders, including Chuck Negron, the lead singer of the band Three Dog Night, who was a known drug user who frequented the Wonderland house. In fact, he and his then wife had been invited to go party there the night of the murders, but declined as they were, quote, too sick, meaning dope sick from withdrawals, which was fucking lucky for them because they probably would have ended up passed out somewhere in that house and then getting murdered. They basically told a similar story. John Holmes did in fact hang out around there, and in fact, Julia, Chuck's wife, who was also the former wife of the Doors drummer John Densmore, said she had gone to the house the morning of the murders after the murders took place and told a neighbor what she saw, but the neighbor didn't call the cops and neither did she. So everything's kind of coming together. They're starting to figure out a timeline. What's crazy is that people who were like coming to the house to buy drugs were walking into the open house, seeing the dead people, seeing the moaning woman on the floor, stealing drugs and money, and fucking leaving. So fucking insane. So anyway, it takes nearly 2 weeks, but on July 12th, detectives Lange and Souza got word that John Holmes had been picked up and was at the Bonaventure Hotel in downtown LA with another set of cops outside their jurisdiction, which they were not happy about. That being said, they were able to meet with Holmes, who ended up telling a different detective some of the details of the murders. Now, as a reminder, he was an informant, so he had a bunch of cop contacts. So it makes sense that he would be with like Vice or somebody instead of the homicide detectives because, you know, John Holmes is trying to um, control the narrative of this scene and kind of get ahead of it, right? So he wants to reach out to his buddies and give them his version of the story before shit gets too real. Now, interestingly, John Holmes actually admitted not only to a part in the robbery of Nash, but also to being a part of the murders. He said he was convinced to leave the front door unlocked at Wonderland, though when they asked who made him do it, he refused to say. He clammed up entirely. He said, "Yeah, I robbed Nash, and yeah, I was there when Wonderland was murdered, but I'm not going to tell you there was a connection, and I'm not going to tell you that Eddie Nash ordered it, or that Gregory Dials was there." He never even mentioned their names. He straight up fucking refused. He did, however, take advantage of now being housed at the Biltmore, another swanky hotel where he had no problem ordering copious amounts of room service while refusing basically to cooperate at all. He had also brought not only Sharon to this hotel, but Dawn as well. And to be clear, Sharon and Dawn had a very interesting relationship where I think Sharon really wanted and felt the need to take care of Dawn and loved Dawn and wanted to sort of save Dawn. So the two women mostly got along because I think Sharon thought of Dawn as like a daughter, which is probably how John Holmes should have seen her, but he's a piece of shit. So there you go. In any case, all of them are there, and he's basically saying, I can cooperate if you put me in witness protection, and if you take Dawn and Sharon, and we can all go. And Sharon's like, get fucked, dude. I'm not leaving my house. I'm not doing this. You're a drug addict. There's something fucking wrong with you. I don't want anything to do with this, right? So I mean, the cops have some stuff and they can sort of place John at the crime scene, but he already admitted to being there. It doesn't mean he actually murdered anybody. He could have just been a witness. He could have been held hostage, which is essentially what he told the cops was the situation. The one thing that they had that was really suspicious and I think kind of led to him being arrested later on was they found a palm print in blood on the bed frame over Ron Lanius's bed, like where his body was. So it was positioned as though whoever grabbed the bed frame was steadying themselves while they were beating Ron to death. Now, this palm print was John's. So, not only does it put him in the house, but it makes it seem like maybe he had actually beat Ron. Now, he could have said, it was under duress. Greg Dials made him do it. And he could have also said that he didn't actually hit anybody, he just grabbed the railing. So there was a lot of kind of like, there wasn't anything solid. So cops weren't ready to press any charges. And in truth, a few of them believed John Holmes that he didn't actually participate in the murders and was just in the rooms being forced to watch while being held at gunpoint, is what he said, which didn't bode well for any case they might want to bring against him. Now, around this time, the medical examiner came back with the cause of death for the victims, and it was found they were all beaten to death with a lead pipe. Not only a lead pipe, but a pipe with threads on the end. They knew this because the threads had embedded in the skin and bone of the victims because they were beaten that hard. Like, they were hit that hard with the pipe. It was around this time that detectives received a letter from a patrol cop out of West Hollywood telling them that Gregory Dials had had many complaints lodged against him while working at the Starwood Club, which is one of the clubs, that's actually the punk rock club, where Eddie did a lot of his drug dealing. But these complaints were for brutality and for using some sort of rod or pipe. And that once he was pulled over and cops found a lead pipe with threading on the end of it in his car. So again, more circumstantial evidence, no proof, but definitely very interesting and lets them know to keep kind of digging. Now, from here, I could get into a ton of details about the interviews of various jailhouse snitches, but suffice it to say there was a lot of talk, but very little concrete evidence. Also, around this time, police were able to get a search warrant for Nash's residence because he got caught selling drugs to a snitch. So they go to his house, and during the search, they're, obviously looking for evidence to tie him to the murders, but they didn't find any. What they did find was documents that he could have only received from somebody in a high ranking position in some sort of law enforcement. So LAPD, FBI, something like that. So that's bad news, and again shows the scope of his influence and connections. And these papers basically let him know that cops were coming to raid his house. That being said, he didn't seem to give a shit because when they raided it, they found a bunch of drugs. So he was, charged with various drug offenses. Now, after this, things sort of calmed down for a bit. There was an insider who tried to claim that that Lange and Souza, the two detectives on the case, were crooked and working for Nash, and that the detectives, were basically throwing the case. And during this time, also, the detectives ended up taking on other cases because they weren't really able to do anything with this case. They ended up getting investigated, and then it turned out that the insider who said that they were working for Nash was actually the one working for Nash. So funny how that works. In any case, things, kind of chill out for a while. John is still around. He's still with Dawn. He's still beating her, forcing her to sell herself, raping her, just being a complete piece of shit. And he's also still informing for the police. So now it's November 1981, same year, just some months later. There's another raid at Nash's house. More cocaine found, more arrests. Like I said, John Holmes just being a piece of shit. And finally, the detectives go to Vice, which is who John Holmes informs for, and said, we need him. And we need to bring him in. We're going to try to, get something out of him. We think we're going to charge him with murder. So Vice is, pushing back because they're like, he's a really good informant. But finally, they agree. John finds out and he takes the fuck off. So the cops go looking for him. They go to South Florida, which is where Dawn has some family. That's a dead end. They go up to Oregon, where Dawn also had family. Sharon tells them, he has her car. She last heard from him in Oregon asking her for money. So they go up there. And then he gave no more information, just asking for money. And she would never officially turn on him anyway, but she gave up where she thought he was. At this time, she also told him that he came to her house the day after the murders, but she meant the morning of, covered in blood and bruises, saying that he'd been at Wonderland. He gave her no more information, and she, wouldn't have told them either way. But it was interesting that she told them that. And I think that it was on her mind and she felt like she needed to get it off her chest. And the other thing is, you don't get covered in blood if you're waiting downstairs, right? So they go to Oregon. They don't find him. They find Dawn's family, who hated John and wanted to help find him and Dawn. And they go back down to LA because they heard he was last there. And then her brother gets in touch and says, I think she's in Florida. She called me from Florida. I probably asking for money. So at this point, John's fully running from not only the cops, but also Eddie Nash, who obviously knows he's about to be arrested for these murders and knows that the cops are doing that so that he'll turn on Nash. And Eddie Nash is not going to let that stand. So he's probably looking for John to fucking kill him, right? And because obviously John Holmes is the type of person who would turn on him. So it's a fair concern. So I'm going to switch gears for a second here because Susan Lanius is waking up. Now, police interview Susan. All she could really say at the time, beyond what they already knew, was that she remembered getting hit and being in excruciating pain. Now, as a reminder, this is, 4 months after the attacks, and she's just finally well enough to talk to the police. She said she remembered seeing red everywhere and hearing someone say that they didn't need to hit her more because she was going to die anyway. She heard the commotion, she heard the beating, she remembered the pain. She also remembered people coming in and out of the house, but she could not, for the life of her, identify a single one of them. She also talked about Ron and what a badass he was and that she thought he'd killed a lot of people, and she was really impressed by that, which is really fucking weird. In any case, the interviews didn't do a lot, but she was still a star witness when John's trial came around because he was arrested. So anyway, they go down to South Florida, the cops. They take Wayne, Dawn's brother, because they're close, down with them. And he starts kind of talking to their family friends from when they lived down there. And with his help, Dawn's location is found. She's living with an exotic dancer who needed somebody to babysit her kids. So she was living with this woman. She was still with John, but sort of living apart from him, which I think is because she had been dealing with this abuse for so long. And she had run away from him before. She'd gone up to Oregon for a few months with her family, but he coaxed her back to him. She'd physically run away from him and almost got murdered by somebody that she was when she was hitchhiking. Like, so she wanted to get away from him, but she was in so deep and she was so fucking terrified, she couldn't get away. So, they're living apart, but they're still together. And when the police, approached Dawn, at first she was really combative, but Wayne convinced her to cooperate and to get away from John. And she finally told the police where John was. So when they arrest him, he says, "What took you so long?" Like, "I've been expecting you," because he just has to be like the cool guy, like he's in a movie, he's Johnny Wad, like whatever the fuck. So anyway, they take him in, they charge him. Like I said, it's an attempt to get him to turn on Eddie Nash. In reality, while they seemingly have a lot on him, they don't really have anything on him. They can put him in the house, they can't really do anything else. They can't put him as actually murdering anyone. And for his part, John's going to say that he was a victim, that he was forced to go there, that he was held at gunpoint, that he didn't do anything besides witness a murder, and he's not going to turn on who did it because he's afraid for his life. While Dawn did get away from him, she still wouldn't testify against him, which is really unfortunate because it later comes out that he confessed to her that he was there, that he saw the murders, and he knew who did it. Likewise, Sharon wouldn't testify against him and legally didn't have to because she was his wife. The only people that they had to testify against him really were Susan Lanius and David Lind. And Susan doesn't remember anything and David wasn't there. So they can put him kind of in the middle of it. They can circumstantially make it seem very clear that he was involved, but there's no hard evidence. They still go to trial, but as you can guess, he is acquitted. And things sort of peter out from there. As far as Johnny Wad goes, he just continues being a piece of shit. Like I said, Dawn thankfully got away from him, but she'd been subjected to 6 years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse by John Holmes and anybody he deemed, necessary to get what he wanted. He used her like she was just a fucking worthless piece of trash. And he did this to her all before she was like 21 years old. And every time she tried to get away from him, he would convince her to come back. He would beg her. And then he would leave her alone with this tiny little dog for days at a time. When he came back, he'd abuse her. He almost killed her. He almost got her killed multiple times. Just, fucking horrible. So finally, she gets away from him and she becomes like a speaker and an advocate for women and girls trapped in abusive relationships and who have been groomed by their partners. So really cool. Look her up. Her website's great. She has a lot of really great, information about herself and kind of what she does. It's honestly really inspiring. She's pretty fucking amazing. John, however, went on as a total complete piece of shit. And eventually in 1984, Sharon divorced him and moved on with her life. From there, John continued to inform on people to feed his addiction and keep himself out of prison, but mostly faded into obscurity. Like, he was still working, but nobody really cared about him. Everybody kind of knew he was a drug addict. And again, he couldn't really perform, so he couldn't really work. So at the time before the murders happened, he had done like a documentary about himself. I don't know if it ever actually came out, but after that, around this time, he wrote an autobiography, which wasn't actually published until after his death. He met and married another adult film star named Misty Dawn, real name Lori Rose, in 1987. It's unclear exactly when, but at some point in the mid 1980s, he learned he had AIDS. He hid this from everyone in his life, including multiple women he worked with on adult films. Now, it's said that he didn't know he had AIDS until just before the last film that he made, but he knew then, and he had unprotected sex with these women because he did not give a shit. He just wanted the fucking money. So he's a fucking scumbag. Like, there's no words, obviously. Now, this asshole, Johnny Wad, Johnny fucking idiot, fucking hate this guy, died in March 1988 at 43 years old from complications of AIDS. Shortly thereafter, his ex-wife Sharon came forward with the official version of her story of what he told her just a few nights after the murder. He'd gone to her house, he got into the bathtub, which you'll see in the Wonderland movie, and He told her that he went to the house that night. He was basically being held hostage at gunpoint, and that he was forced to not only let 3 men into the house to murder everyone inside, but he was forced to go in and to watch as they murdered all of those people. Now, he never gave Sharon the names of the people who did it, and he never admitted to any further involvement. But he did tell her that he was there and he knew who did it, and he told Dawn the same thing. I personally believe that he probably hit Ron, that he was forced maybe to do it, but he also hated Ron, and he seems like a little bitch, John Holmes, so I feel like he probably would have done it. The story, however, is not over. There's a little bit more, because remember Eddie Nash. So the year after John's death, prosecutors decided to charge Eddie Nash and Gregory Diles for the Wonderland murders. They made this decision after a witness came forward with pretty damning evidence. And this witness was none other than Liberace's son turned lover, Scott Thorson. Now, he and Liberace were not together anymore at this point. It was really sad about Scott Thorson's life is really sad if you read about it. He was like in foster care and I think 17 years old when he met Liberace. And Liberace groomed him just like John Holmes groomed Dawn. But it was even worse. He adopted Scott like as his son, made him get plastic surgery to look more like Liberace, to look more like him, created a sexual relationship with him, and put him on a weight loss program that ultimately got him addicted to drugs, all before he was like 20 years old. So this is a really fucked up situation. And the weirdest thing is that Liberace was super against drugs, but weirdly was in business with Eddie Nash at one of the nightclubs. Like Liberace co-owned part of it and had Scott sort of managing that for him. So Liberace had no idea that Eddie Nash was so into the drug scene. And for a time, he didn't know that Scott was into the drug scene. So he would send Scott down to LA. They were living in, I think, Lake Tahoe at the time, or Vegas, because I think Liberace was performing in Vegas like every night. So he would send Scott down to pick up money from the club, and Scott would just buy a bunch of fucking drugs while he was there. And on the night of the murders, Scott Thorson, like I had said, was at Eddie Nash's home. Now, when he was there, he overheard everything that happened with John Holmes, including him being beaten, the threats to his life, the threats to his family's lives. He heard Nash say, you're going to take Greg Diles and these 2 other men to Wonderland, and you're going to, quote, kill everyone. He was also at the house, at Eddie Nash's house, when they all came back covered in blood. He later, in an interview in the 2000s, said they had in fact taken his car to do the killings, but who really knows? Apparently, anybody and everybody who met Scott thought that he was just like a pathological liar, but nobody could ever fully catch him in a lie, and his testimony did match what police thought happened pretty much entirely, so I do tend to believe him, at least in this situation. So Eddie Nash and Gregory Diles went on trial in 1991. They were on trial for a few weeks, but in the end, the jury ended up being hung 11-1. Now, they had Susan, they had David Lind, they had Scott Thorson. It was a done fucking deal, but one juror hung on, would not change their mind. They ended up going to trial again and then were acquitted. I'm not really sure why. It probably has to do with the legal system, things you can't do twice. Who fucking knows? However, it later came out that the first trial ended the way it did because Nash bribed a woman on the jury with $50,000. So he bought his freedom because everybody else knew he fucking did it. And if that juror had not been bribed, he would have gone to prison for the rest of his life, and so would have Gregory Diles. Greg Diles died in 1995, and fuck him, who cares? Scott Thorson, after the trial, went into witness protection, but didn't stay out of trouble and ended up getting shot 5 times in a motel in South Florida over a bad drug deal. He also did more time in prison before finding Jesus and getting sober for about 10 years before he died of cancer in 2021. Eddie Nash eventually got sent to prison on RICO charges, including being charged for bribing the juror in the first murder trial, which he did plead guilty to, and arranging for the murders of the Wonderland gang. He did, or was sentenced to, a whopping 37 months in prison for all of this, probably got out early for good behavior, and eventually died in 2014 at the age of 85. Which, on top of it being frustrating that he, didn't have to go to prison, he was 85 years old. He had fucking destroyed his body to the point where he was missing a lung. One of his nasal cavities was fucking gone. And this motherfucker lived to 85? Like, what the fuck? What, do you, like, pickle himself? I don't understand. Anyway, that's pretty much the end of this story. There's so much more if you really want to get into the details. But for a podcast, you can't go too crazy. If you want to read more about it, you can listen. You can read Dawn's book. It's available all over the place. There's a book that the detectives wrote that I read. It was fucking kind of shitty. I mean, it had a lot of information, but it also had a lot of cop talk. And anybody who knows me knows that I'm not really into cops. I'm not really down for cops. So like having to read their like snarky comments just kind of bummed me out. But it's really interesting to read about the case and sort of like the behind the scenes details. It was a really fucked up situation, but people like Ron Lanius, like you can't really feel bad for them because they're such like hardcore pieces of shit. He was actually, I forgot to mention this earlier, he was discharged from the army. Some people argue that it was dishonorable. Some people said he just, left. But he was caught during his time smuggling cocaine back from, I think he was in like the Korean War, I want to say. He was smuggling cocaine in the caskets of dead soldiers. So he would stick the cocaine, like, I don't know, in their bodies, under their bodies, in their fucking caskets, and then take it out when they got back to America. So even before the war, Ron Lanius was a complete disgusting piece of shit. All of the people, David Lind dating a 22-year-old when he's 40, he's a fucking white supremacist, he's a biker, he's in and out of prison, like, fuck him too, It's hard to mourn these people, but the case is so fucked up. It's so violent, it's so brutal, and it's so, like, pulpy and noiry and like perfectly LA that I really wanted to cover it, even though the only thing I wouldn't really call it is sad, except for Dawn. Dawn's really the only person in this story that brings humanity to it. And so it's really good to know that she's out living her best life, helping others. And I also think it's really great that after John died, she and Sharon became really, really close until Sharon died in 2012. Like they were very, very tight. Susan Lanius, for all I know, she disappeared and hopefully is having like a normal life out there. And the case, and it, at least, as the legal system is concerned, remains unsolved to this day, which is fucking crazy because everybody knows exactly who did it. I mean, there's maybe one or two guys that we don't know. We don't have their names, but Gregory Giles and Eddie Nash were definitely, it was them. So all this being said, I'm going to leave you with one of the worst quotes I've ever read from John Holmes. It's just so douchey. Who wrote in his autobiography, "How big is it?" my fans would scream. "Bigger than a payphone, smaller than a Cadillac," was my reply. And that's going to do it for this episode of True Crime California. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening in. I'll have a new case for you next week. And until then, thanks for listening.